Hello friends, this is Mike from Wright, and this is the explanations video for SAT 2's Writing and Language section, passage number 3, question 25. Now question 25 comes at the bottom of the first page, and it's going to have to do with the rest of the stuff, so let's just read down to there. Alright, so this is environmentalist otters. It has long been known that the sea otters living along the west coast of North America help keep kelp forests and their habitat healthy and vital. Now, it happens that this is the right answer choice, so we're just going to read that as is. This is how it should read. It's long been known that the west coast sea otters, they help kelp. Otters help kelp. Alright, they do this by feeding on sea urchins and other herbivorous invertebrates that graze voraciously on kelp. Alright, otters eat sea urchins eat kelp. So that's how the otters help the kelp. They eat the urchins eat the kelp. So the otters eat the stuff that eats the kelp. That helps the kelp. With sea otters, to keep this population of sea urchins in check, kelp forests can flourish. So with sea otters there, the kelp forest can flourish. In fact, and then here we're going to substitute the actual correct claim, and this is from answer choice B over here. Even 2 years or less of sea otter presence can reduce the sea urchin threat. So in fact, according to this chart, even 2 years or less of sea otter presence can reduce the sea urchin threat. Okay? Now we get to the sentence in question. Without sea otters present, nevertheless, kelp forests run the danger of becoming barren stretches of coastal wasteland known as urchin barrens. All right, so when you read a sentence like this that has a question in it, you want to go from this question in the passage to where the question is shown along with all the other questions, and just ask yourself, what kind of question is this? Is this a grammar question where all we need is this sentence, how it's constructed? Are we trying to figure out how we should phrase the same thought? Or is this a writing strategy question where the answer is going to be dependent on the content, on the full context of the passage, on the ideas expressed in the passage? Now, this is a transition words question. It's about which word should we use to transition from one thought to another. And these transition questions, even though they kind of look like grammar questions because they don't have a prompt, for example, they really are writing strategy questions. That is, they really are the kind of questions that you need to have an understanding of what the passage is about in order to answer them. Here, our understanding of which of these words we want to use isn't going to be about which of them sounds best or which of them fits grammatically best into the passage, but rather it's going to be about the content of the thought that comes before and the content of the thought that comes after them and how these two thoughts interrelate. Does one of these cause the other? Does this cause that? Is this just supporting that? Are these two totally unrelated things? Do they conflict? It's that kind of thinking that's going to inform our answer. And so because of that, we want to have a real understanding of the paragraph as a whole, the main thoughts of the paragraph as a whole, and then specifically the thought that comes immediately above and the thought that comes immediately below. All right, so let's get there. Here again, in this paragraph, the core thing that happened in the paragraph is we're describing this relationship between otters and kelp. Otters help kelp. They help kelp by eating urchins, right? Kelp is this thing. Kelp gets eaten by urchins. Otters come in, they eat the urchins, so there's no more stuff eating kelp, so that's how otters help kelp. All right, and now we're comparing right before and right after this sentence. We're comparing the situation between, and you can see this in my notes right here. We're comparing two situations. The first situation is the situation where with sea otters present. The first situation is when sea otters are present. Right? With sea otters present, with sea otters to keep the population of sea urchins in check, kelp forests can flourish. This is to say, when sea otters are there, kelp does really well. And this is something that we can see from the graph. When sea otters are there, kelp does really well. Now, in our sentence here, it says, without sea otters present, something, nevertheless, or however, or hence, or likewise, kelp forests run the danger of becoming barren stretches of coastal wasteland known as urchin barrens. Here I'm just going to write a quick note here. I'm just going to say, no otters, kelp, death. All right, this is what happens when you don't have kelp. Or sorry, when you don't have otters. All the kelp dies. So in thinking about which word we should use right here to transition between the thought that comes above and the thought that comes below, we want to keep in mind that essentially what we're doing is comparing kelp's situation with otters and kelp's situation without otters. And here again, the situation when there are otters there, the kelp is doing great. Without otters, the kelp is screwed. There's a lot of kelp death, right? And these two are very opposite outcomes. With otters, kelp is super happy. Without otters, kelp is screwed. That core understanding of what's going on in this passage is going to get us maybe 80%, 90% of the way toward our right answer choice. Here, the word that we want to use to transition between these two thoughts, with sea otters, the kelp is great. Without the sea otters, kelp is screwed, is a word like, well, in answer choice B, it's a word like however. It's a word that sets up a contrast between the top idea and the bottom idea. So let's jump straight to the wrongness of C and D, because they fall short in this respect. Here, let's start with C. Answer choice C says hence. Hence is a word that we use. It's a substitute for therefore. And hence, what it means is the idea that comes above, the thing I just said, is what's causing the thing I'm about to say. Right? So here, the idea that's being expressed by hence would be that with sea otters present, to keep the population of sea urchins in check, kelp forests can flourish. So sea otters are there. So when sea otters are there, kelp is doing fine. Because of that, without the sea otters there, kelp doesn't do fine. Now, it isn't because of the fact that when they're there, they're helpful, that makes it so that when they're not there, they're not helpful. In fact, both of those two phenomena are caused by the same thing, the fact that otters eat urchins. Likewise, it isn't. There's no contrast set up by the word hence. There isn't this sort of natural causal link from one to the other. All right, so there's the wrongness of C. All right, let's move on to answer choice D, and we're going to explore what the word likewise does. Here, the word likewise is a word that we use when we're about to add something onto what we've just said that's new. It's not like we're just restating the thing that we've just said. It's a new thing, but it's a similar thing. Likewise is kind of like also or along the same lines. We want to add something new that goes in the same direction as the thing that we've just said. So here my example of this is on International Students' Day, the Spanish exchange students made a delicious paella and brought it in for the class to share. Right? Likewise, and now here we want to add something that's similar but new. Right? So likewise, the Korean exchange students brought in kimchi for all of us to share. Right? Here we've used the likewise to introduce something that's different. It's not like we're saying, like, in other words, like other Spanish exchange students also brought more paella. Right? We're saying likewise, something similar happened with a different group of people. Right? You really don't want to say, and this is what's going on in the sentence right here. So in the sentence we have these two ideas. First, with sea otters presence, the kelp is doing great. Without the sea otters present, the kelp is screwed. Here, trying to apply likewise to that situation is kind of like saying in our previous example, on International Students' Day, the Spanish exchange students made a delicious paella for the class to share. Likewise, the domestic students who are from America didn't bring shit because they aren't international students. Right? That's not the same thing. We're not introducing like along the same lines. Instead, we're introducing something that goes directly opposite of the idea that we initially expressed. Right? So likewise doesn't work for the same reason in this example. You can't say that with the sea otters, the kelp is doing great. Likewise, without the sea otters, the kelp is totally screwed. Right? That isn't likewise. In fact, these are opposite things. All right. Let's look now to answer choice A, thinking about the word nevertheless. Now, nevertheless is a word that kind of means yes, but. Really how it functions in a sentence, it says, even though the stuff I just said above is true, even though that stuff is true, still, and then we're going to say the stuff below. Here, a good example of nevertheless is, Julia knew that Olaf was her cousin. Nevertheless, she asked him to prom. Now, that nevertheless operates because the fact that Julia knew that Olaf was her cousin probably suggests to most people that not the best idea to ask him to prom. But even though she knew that he was her cousin, she still decided to ask him to prom. Now that's nevertheless used correctly in a different example. And so if we're trying to apply it to this sentence, and really to this construction where we're comparing these two situations, one, the sea otters are present and the kelp is doing great, and the sea otters are not present and the kelp is screwed. Here we want to say, with the sea otters present, the kelp is doing great. But even though that's true, for some reason, without the sea otters, they're screwed. Well, that's not what's going on. There's nothing about the fact that with the sea otters present, the kelp is doing great that suggests that without the sea otters, the kelp would be screwed. In fact, it's kind of the other way around. If the kelp is only doing well when the sea otters are present, it suggests that the kelp should not be doing well when the sea otters aren't present. So there's not that same situation where it's like, even though this is true, this is miraculously still true. So that's where the nevertheless falls short. Now, incidentally, I want to add just sort of as a grammar note, you don't typically use nevertheless in the middle of a sentence like this. So sort of separately, without sea otters present, nevertheless, kelp forests run the danger, blah, blah, blah. That's not a conventional use of the word nevertheless. Usually nevertheless has to come at the beginning of an independent clause. It needs to become or at the beginning of a sentence or after a semicolon. Here in my previous example, Julia knew Olaf was her cousin, period. Nevertheless, blah, 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 blah. So that's like a separate grammar reason why nevertheless isn't wrong, or is wrong. But really the main reason, and especially with respect to these transition questions, there will always be this kind of main reason where nevertheless just isn't the fitting word for the ideas being expressed. Now turning to however, however is really the perfect word to transition from one side of the coin to the other, totally opposite side of the coin. Right? With sea otters present, the kelp is doing great. However, without sea otters present, the kelp is screwed. So just reading it in context with however in there, and hopefully you'll be able to hear the correctness of it. With sea otters to keep the population of sea urchins in check, kelp forests can flourish. In fact, even 2 years or less of sea otter presence can reduce the sea urchin threat in a coastal area. See the chart. Without sea otters present, however, kelp forests run the danger of becoming barren stretches of coastal wasteland known as urchin barrens. Now, I've talked to a few students who have expressed that the word however seemed weird to them. It seemed grammatically weird to them when used in the middle of a sentence like this. This is parallel to the point I just made where you don't usually use the word nevertheless in the middle of a sentence like this. And it was new to them that you were allowed to use the word however in the middle of a sentence like this. If that's you, then just, chalk that up to your inexperience. You're still in high school. You don't know every single use of every single word in the world. And now is the time when you can learn that, yes, you are allowed to use the word however in the middle of a sentence like this. Without the sea otters present, however, kelp forests run the danger of blah, blah, blah. That sentence construction is grammatical. It's conventional. It's the kind of thing we often say. It's the kind of thing we often write. It's the kind of thing you're allowed to do. All right, that's it for this question. See you in the next one.